I have walked into many crime scenes in my career. Some smelled of gasoline and blood. Others felt heavy with the silence of someone who had been fighting for their life. But there is one type of scene that haunts investigators more than any murder, more than any confession, more than any set of fingerprints left drying on a windowsill. It is the scene that has nothing. No body, no struggle, no answers. Only absence. June 7th, 1992 became one of those nights, a date carved into the investigative memory of Springfield, Missouri. A night that would swallow 3 women whole: Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Suzanne "Susie" Streeter, and Susie's friend Stacy McCall. And in the years ahead, this case would swallow a part of me too. When I, Miller Files, look back at the Springfield Three, I see something more than a missing persons file. I see a ghost, not a supernatural one, but the kind made of unanswered questions, dead ends, and the chilling certainty that someone out there knows exactly what happened. To understand what we lost that night, we must start with what should have been a celebration. The night before the disappearance was a night of bright lights, caps flying, camera flashes, and laughter from newly graduated high school seniors. For Stacy and Susie, June 6th had been a long and happy day, full of parties scattered across town. They moved from house to house, celebrating their future, unaware that within 24 hours, their names would be known across the entire state for reasons no one could imagine. Their plan had been simple. After leaving the last party, they intended to rest at a hotel. But Springfield had been buzzing with graduates, families, and visitors. Every bed was full, so the girls made the decision that would seal their fate. They drove to Susie's home, a quiet one-story house on East Delmar Street, where her mother Cheryl had been preparing for a quiet night of her own. Cheryl had spent the day working at her beauty salon. Tired, she returned home earlier that night. She did not answer phone calls later in the evening. She was known to rest early, especially after long shifts. Nothing about the house, the street, or the neighborhood hinted that by morning it would become the center of one of the most perplexing disappearances in American criminal history. To walk you through it, I must take you hour by hour. Around 2 in the morning, the girls left the last graduation party. They were seen laughing, tired, ready to call it a night. Stacy, ever polite, told her family she would be home early the next day to pack for a trip with friends. Susie planned to get ready for a new chapter of her own life. They had no enemies, no debts, no conflicts, nothing that suggested danger. But danger doesn't always announce itself. When they arrived at Cheryl's home, the night was still. The porch light glowed. The neighborhood slept. And sometime between that moment and sunrise, all 3 women vanished from within that house without a trace. I remember reviewing the earliest officer notes. They described the scene as undisturbed. But disturbingly undisturbed, the kind of calm that sets off every alarm in a detective's mind. All 3 women's purses were still lined up neatly in the living room. A pack of cigarettes, keys, clothes folded on chairs, Stacy's shorts placed carefully on top of her purse. The sort of precise, subconscious order. A person leaves when they believe they will return in a moment. But they never returned. The first people to realize something was wrong were Stacy's friends. They arrived at the house on Delmar Street around 8 in the morning. They knocked, no answer. They entered because in 1992 in Springfield, doors were often left unlocked. Inside, everything seemed normal, too normal. There was a broken porch light on the front deck, shattered glass scattered around the welcome mat. One friend swept it away, thinking nothing of it, a seemingly innocent action that would unknowingly erase potential evidence forever. The friends also listened to voice messages on the answering machine. One message, reportedly from a man, unsettled them so much that someone deleted it. To this day, the contents of that message remain unknown, locked away in history. There was no blood, no overturned furniture. The dog, a small Yorkie named Cinnamon, was anxious, pacing in circles. But if there had been a struggle, it had been quick, silent, controlled. Investigators, like me, don't fear scenes of chaos. Chaos leaves trails. But the Springfield house offered only silence. And silence is a far more dangerous enemy. When police were finally notified later that day, the crucial early hours had already slipped away. The home had been visited, cleaned in small ways, touched, altered, layers of clues contaminated not by malice, but by concern and confusion. Still, the most critical detail was clear. None of the three women had left voluntarily. Not at that hour, not leaving behind purses, money, cars, and a house full of signs of everyday life paused suddenly. This was an abduction, but abductions involving three adult women simultaneously are almost unheard of. The logistics alone tell investigators something vital. Whoever did this was confident, experienced, and likely not acting alone. Over the years, I have mapped the timeline hundreds of times. Each time, the window of opportunity shrinks into a razor-thin sliver. From the moment the girls arrived home to the first visit from friends, only a few hours passed. That suggests the perpetrator was either watching, waiting, or already aware of their movements. The chance of a random intruder stumbling into the perfect opportunity is exceedingly small. Let's examine the last confirmed moments of each woman's life. At the graduation parties, several witnesses saw Susie and Stacy together. There were no arguments, no suspicious followers, no unfamiliar vehicles reported trailing them. Their drive from the party to East Delmar Street was short and uneventful. Cheryl, at home alone, had made small preparations for the night. A television was left on. Her bed covers were pulled back, as though she had been getting ready to sleep. Evidence suggests she was awake when the girls returned. But whether she heard something at the door or was approached first remains a question without an answer. The broken light on the porch suggests an attempt to get someone to open the door. A thrown object or a forceful knock could have startled Cheryl into responding. We cannot know whether she encountered danger first or whether all three women were taken together after the girls entered the house. In abductions, the point of control is crucial. If a perpetrator gains control of one person with a weapon, it becomes easier to control the others. But the silence in the house tells me this was executed with precision. No one screamed. No neighbors awoke. Either the abductor had a weapon and acted quickly, or the women were taken under false pretenses before realizing the danger. There is something else. Their cars were still there. Keys inside. The abductor had transportation prepared. A secondary vehicle large enough to hold three adults. That means planning. That eliminates the idea of a spontaneous attack. Someone expected to be there that night. I have studied their lives, their routines, their relationships. The list of people with potential access or knowledge was long at first. Old acquaintances from Cheryl's salon, former boyfriends, friends of friends from high school, individuals who had grudges or obsessions or histories of violence. But one name surfaced repeatedly over the years: Robert Craig Cox. Cox was a convicted kidnapper and murderer. He lived in Springfield at the time of the disappearance. He spoke cryptically to both police and journalists over the years. He claimed he knew what happened to the three women. He claimed they were dead. He claimed their bodies would never be found. But claims without evidence are shadows. And yet, Sometimes shadows hide the truth. Still, the early hours of June 7th remain the key. Police estimates place the abduction between 2 and 4 in the morning. That narrow window narrows even further when we consider the lack of noise and lack of struggle. The women either opened the door willingly for someone they trusted, or they were ambushed before they could react. As I reconstruct this case, I imagine them inside the house, Stacy folding her clothes, Susie setting her belongings beside her mother, Cheryl checking the front door before bed, Cinnamon barking softly at an unfamiliar sound, and then a knock, or a shatter, or a voice calling from the porch. Something drew at least one of them toward the front door. Detectives follow patterns. Human behavior rarely breaks them, but this case broke everyone. By the time sunrise painted the streets of Springfield, 3 lives had been erased. Their belongings remained, their memories remained, their absence remained, but the women themselves were gone without a trace. There were no ransom calls, no sightings, no credible leads, only theories. And theories can drown investigators if they are not careful. But even in the earliest days, a theory I couldn't shake lodged itself in my mind. Someone had stalked them, watched them, waited for them. This was not an accident of timing. It was a planned operation. Whether the target was Susie or Cheryl, or simply any vulnerable women arriving late at night, remains uncertain. But the intent was deliberate. As the investigation widened, searches extended to woods, lakes, abandoned farmland. Thousands of hours spent, hundreds of interviews conducted. Tips came in waves, often leading nowhere. Psychics, rumors, false sightings. The case became a magnet for speculation, but the truth stayed buried deeper than any shallow grave. There is one detail many overlook. Cheryl was renovating her home. Several construction sites nearby were active during that period. Fresh concrete, new foundations. Places where bodies could be concealed forever. A later tip would lead to ground-penetrating radar scans beneath a local hospital parking garage, revealing anomalies consistent with 3 possible burial sites. But still, no excavation, no confirmation, no closure. When we look at the Springfield Three, we are not just looking at a disappearance. We are looking at a perfectly executed vanishing, a disappearance so absolute that after 3 decades, not a bone, not a hair, not a scrap of fabric has resurfaced. Perfect crimes are rare, but perfect disappearances are even rarer. As I narrate this case to you, I carry the weight of those 3 women, their unfinished lives, their families' lingering grief, the echo of their last night preserved only in photographs and memories. But our journey into this case has only begun. Part 1 sets the stage. Part 2 will dive deeper into the backgrounds of the 3 women, the geography of the crime, the psychological profile of the abductor, and the investigative missteps that may have sealed the outcome. For now, remember this. The Springfield Three did not walk away. They were taken. And whoever took them knew exactly what they were doing. End of Part 1. When a disappearance becomes large enough, when it becomes the kind of mystery that grips a whole community for decades, the victims can fade into symbols. They become headlines, posters on telephone poles, names whispered in speculation. But before the night of June 7th, 1992, before the quiet hours that erased them from their own home, Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were not symbols. They were people with texture, with routines, with hopes, with flaws, with futures. If we are to understand the magnitude of this case, we must step back into who they were before they became the Springfield Three. Cheryl was a woman shaped by resilience. Divorced, independent, and hardworking, she had rebuilt her life more than once. She owned a small but loyal beauty salon where conversations flowed as easily as the curling irons. Clients trusted her. Friends admired her. Her co-workers described her as soft-spoken but steady, a woman who organized her world carefully. Her home reflected that, from the neatly folded towels to the carefully arranged shelves of knickknacks. She lived alone except for her daughter, Susie, and the family dog. She valued stability, routine, and the comfort of a quiet evening spent reading or watching the local news. She was not the kind of person who opened her door for strangers. Her daughter, Susie, was 19 and stood at the threshold of adulthood, full of contradictions that made her both complex and endearing. She had streaks of rebellion, a fondness for edgy fashion, and a fiery independence that clashed with authority at times. Yet, she was also loyal, sensitive, and deeply protective of the people she cared about. Her relationship with her mother had its battles, as most mother-daughter relationships do. But beneath those clashes was a genuine closeness. They had survived divorce together, financial hardship together, and the turbulent years of adolescence. They were not just family, but partners navigating life side by side. Susie had envisioned a summer of rebuilding, of shaping her future. She could not have imagined the future that would be stolen from her. Her friend, Stacy, was the kind of girl whose presence lightened a room. 18, with a warm smile and the soft optimism of someone just stepping into the world. She had a reputation for kindness. Teachers described her as dependable. Friends described her as gentle. She had been planning a trip to a water park with her best friends the morning she disappeared. She had even called her family earlier that night to confirm she would be home in time. Her future was a simple one by teenage standards. She wanted to enjoy the summer, begin community college, and continue building her life. She had never been involved in anything dangerous. She had no enemies. She was not a person who attracted trouble. This is the part investigators must absorb but rarely speak aloud. When the victims are people who led careful and peaceful lives, their disappearances point more clearly toward an external force. Something or someone intruded violently into their world. And that intrusion did not begin at the moment of abduction. It began earlier. To understand the forces surrounding the victims, I examined the geography of Springfield. The city in 1992 was a blend of suburban quiet and growing commercial zones. Neighborhoods like East Delmar Street offered the illusion of safety. Houses stood close together. Porches faced the street. Curtains fluttered in the breeze. Yet it is in such places that danger can thrive unnoticed. A person can watch from a parked car without drawing attention. A stranger can walk the sidewalk at midnight without suspicion. A predator can blend in by pretending to be a neighbor, a repairman, a passerby. The Levitt home was an ideal target for someone who wanted privacy. Tucked slightly back from the street, shaded by trees, it offered an unhindered view of arrivals and departures. Anyone watching would have known exactly when the girls returned home that night. They would have known when lights turned off, when the neighborhood fell quiet, and when the perfect moment arrived. As I studied the case years later, I saw the invisible network of opportunity that a seasoned offender would have recognized instantly. 3 women arriving late, a quiet street, a broken porch light that could have been smashed intentionally to draw them outside, a small dog that would not pose a threat, and no male presence in the home. Predators are observant in ways ordinary people do not realize. They study patterns. They notice if a man ever stays over. They track who leaves the house and when. By the time the night of the abduction came, someone may have known far too much about the rhythms of that home. One key question shapes this phase of the investigation. Was the target Cheryl, Susie, or simply whoever happened to be there. Investigators have long debated this. Some argue that Susie's past associations could have drawn danger to her doorstep. Others believe Cheryl's business placed her in contact with questionable individuals. Yet another theory holds that they were victims of opportunity, chosen because they arrived at the wrong place at the wrong time. In my analysis, the level of control demonstrated in this abduction suggests intent. This was not an impulsive crime. It required surveillance, timing, and the confidence to overpower three people silently. Such precision is rarely associated with random acts. During this stage of the original investigation, resources were stretched thin. Missing persons cases in the first 48 hours are always frantic, but this one became chaotic. Family members and friends entered the house repeatedly before forensic teams arrived. Crucial clues were wiped away by innocent hands. The phone messages were deleted. The porch glass was swept aside. A dish in the sink might have been moved. A bed sheet shifted. Every small change altered the crime scene in ways that will forever distort what truly happened. Still, the investigators of the time did what they could. They interviewed dozens of witnesses. They mapped the girl's movements with painstaking detail. They searched the surrounding woods, riverbanks, and remote fields. They issued bulletins statewide. But every hour that passed made the likelihood of recovery smaller. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is the psychological profile of the offender. Based on the execution of the abduction, the perpetrator or perpetrators exhibited traits consistent with organized offenders. Organized criminals plan thoroughly. They choose locations where their actions can be concealed. They manipulate victims into compliance through deception or sudden intimidation. They remove the victims from the scene efficiently, leaving minimal evidence. In reviewing offender typologies, I see hints of predatory patience. A person comfortable waiting in the dark. Someone who understood how to create a moment of vulnerability. Someone who had removed victims before and knew exactly how to leave silence behind. Whether this person acted alone or with an accomplice remains uncertain. But in my judgment, the likelihood of multiple offenders is high. 3 adults cannot be subdued easily by a single person without resistance. Even with a weapon, the risk of a scream or struggle is significant. But 2 offenders can control 3 victims with frightening efficiency. There is another aspect to consider. Fear. Not the victim's fear, but the abductor's lack of it. Whoever committed this crime did not fear being discovered. They operated within a narrow time window, but their boldness suggests familiarity with the area or confidence in their plan. They knew the neighbors would be asleep. They knew no patrol car would pass at that hour. They likely knew what direction to leave in and where to dispose of the victims without detection. In the second phase of my examination, I looked at the missteps not to assign blame, but to understand how the truth slipped through the cracks. Police departments in 1992 did not have the forensic tools we rely on today. DNA recovery was limited. Phone tracing required legal maneuvers that took time. Surveillance cameras were rare. Without those tools, investigators relied heavily on witness testimony and physical evidence, much of which was compromised. The most devastating loss was the answering machine message. Its deletion severed what might have been the only direct communication from the offender. Even the tone of the caller, the cadence of speech, the urgency or calmness could have provided insight. In cases of abduction, offenders sometimes call to test boundaries or to psychologically toy with victims' families. This call may have been meaningless, Or it may have been the key. Years later, as I continued to study the Springfield Three, I realized how deeply timing shaped the entire tragedy. The victims returned home within a window of vulnerability. They were taken within a window so small that it suggests preparation. And investigators lost the most critical early hours, not because of incompetence, but because of human concern. Friends wanted to help. Families wanted answers. But crime scenes do not forgive human instincts. Every touch erases something. Every movement shifts the truth a little further away. By the end of the first week, the city understood that this was not a routine case. Flyers appeared in shop windows. Volunteers searched parks and abandoned lots. News anchors spoke with a tone reserved for national tragedies. But behind the public face of the investigation, the police were struggling with something deeper. They had no direction, no suspects, no ransom demands. They were confronting an emptiness that did not behave like other missing persons cases. This is the weight that lingers for investigators. A crime with no answers becomes a shadow that follows you, and in Springfield, the shadow was growing. As this part of our examination closes, understand this. The Springfield Three were not victims of randomness. They were victims of a predator who prepared meticulously, executed decisively, and vanished without a trace. Part 3 will delve into the suspects, including those who inserted themselves into the case, those who bragged about knowing the truth, and those who vanished from Springfield shortly after the abduction. We will also examine the theory that the bodies may have been entombed in concrete beneath a local hospital's parking structure. What comes next is darker, more detailed, and more unsettling. But in pursuit of the truth, we must follow the trail even when it leads underground. End of Part 2. When an investigation reaches a point where the evidence runs dry and the clues dissolve into dust, detectives turn to the next place where truth likes to hide. People. Not just the families or the friends, but the ones who orbit around the tragedy like moths circling a flame. Some come forward with genuine intent. Others arrive because they want to feel involved. And some appear because they cannot resist the urge to insert themselves into a narrative soaked in fear and uncertainty. In the Springfield Three investigation, those people multiplied quickly, and among them were individuals who would change the tone of the case forever. During the first few weeks after the disappearance, every routine suspect surfaced: ex-boyfriends, acquaintances with criminal records, former customers of Cheryl's salon, and anyone who had even brushed shoulders with the victims in the weeks prior. Most approached the police willingly. Many were cleared quickly. But one name would return again and again, like a dark echo: Robert Craig Cox. Cox was not from Springfield originally. He was a drifter with a ready of violence. Years before the Springfield Three vanished, Cox had been convicted for the murder of a young woman in Florida, although that conviction was later overturned on appeal. The courts deemed the evidence insufficient. But in the eyes of many investigators, including myself, lack of legal proof does not always equal innocence. Cox had also been involved in the abduction of 2 other women, leaving behind a pattern that was unmistakable. He had the capacity, the history, and the coldness that fit the psychological profile of someone who could execute a triple disappearance. At the time of the Springfield abductions, Cox was living and working in the city. He had a job at a car dealership. He attended church. He blended in with unsettling ease. And when detectives first questioned him, he presented himself calmly, too calmly. People who are innocent usually exude confusion, fear, anxiety. Cox exuded something else: control. But what drew attention was not just who he was, but what he eventually chose to say. Years after the case went cold, Cox granted an interview to a local reporter. In that interview, he stated without hesitation that he knew the women were dead. He claimed he knew what had happened to them. He claimed their bodies would never be found. And, as if tightening a noose around the city's hope, he said he would reveal everything one day when his mother died. He never said why. Every investigator who watched that interview felt a familiar chill. When killers speak like that, they often do so for one of two reasons. Either they are telling the truth and enjoy holding power over the narrative, or they are lying for attention. With Cox, both possibilities were equally terrifying. Yet, Cox was not the only figure to cast a shadow over the case. As weeks turned into months, the police encountered an unsettling influx of people who generated false leads. There were men who claimed they had seen the three women at convenience stores, truck stops, or gas stations. None of these sightings were substantiated. There were anonymous callers who insisted the women had been taken to Oklahoma, Arkansas, or even Mexico. Reporters received letters filled with cryptic language. Psychics offered visions. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. And then there was the tip that came from beneath the ground. Years after the abduction, a local man approached authorities with a claim that would ignite public speculation. He said that while working on the construction of a new hospital parking structure in 1993, he believed he had witnessed something disturbing. According to his account, he suspected that 3 bodies had been buried in the concrete foundation before it was poured. He had stayed silent for years, fearing retaliation or disbelief, but guilt eventually drove him forward. The location he pointed to was the Cox South Hospital parking garage. The irony of the name was not lost on anyone. Investigators arranged for ground-penetrating radar scans. The results indicated 3 anomalies beneath the concrete, each roughly the size of a human body. The radar technician who conducted the scan stated that the anomalies were highly consistent with burial sites. The city braced itself. Hope flickered beneath the grief. But then, as often happens in cases like this, bureaucracy smothered momentum. Authorities determined that excavating the parking structure would cost millions and risk structural collapse. Without irrefutable proof, the decision was made: no digging. 3 potential graves beneath a public hospital, and no way to know. Over the decades, I have revisited that decision countless times. Some mysteries persist because they are hidden well. Others persist because agencies fear the consequences of uncovering them. The Springfield Three case became both. During the original investigation, another man emerged briefly as a suspect, a transient with a history of drug use who had been seen wandering near East Delmar Street in the early morning hours. Witnesses described him as disheveled, muttering, acting erratic. For a moment he seemed like a viable lead, but his alibi held. His presence near the scene was a coincidence, nothing more. Even so, his appearance reinforced a bleak truth. Springfield, like many Midwestern cities in the early 90s, contained pockets of desperation that could easily mask predatory behavior. Yet no one matched the psychological profile as closely as Cox. In one jailhouse interview, Cox leaned forward and said something that stayed with me long after I first studied the transcript. He said that the women had not suffered. He said they were gone quickly. When the reporter pressed him, asking whether he was confessing, he smiled. A small smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. Then he simply said he would not reveal anything more. It was not a denial. It was not an admission. It was a taunt. This is the part of the case that lingers in the quiet corners of my mind. Killers who enjoy control rarely stop at committing the crime. They also derive pleasure from controlling the story. Cox seemed to enjoy watching the city unravel in speculation. He liked knowing that he held something the world wanted. Whether he was involved or not, he chose to make himself a ghost in the narrative, flickering in and out of focus just enough to maintain power. But perhaps most haunting is the absence of evidence linking him definitively to the scene. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA, nothing that ties him physically to the Levitt home. In some ways, this makes him more dangerous. It suggests a level of expertise that few offenders possess. His criminal record reveals a man capable of precision. His demeanor reveals a man who thrives on silence. His statements reveal a man who understands how to strangle hope without lifting a finger. Still, the investigation did not end with Cox. There were other names, other corners of Springfield that investigators probed. A young man who had once dated Susie and allegedly stalked her briefly. A pair of brothers with a history of assault who lived within walking distance of East Delmar Street. Several men who had been clients of Cheryl's salon but exhibited aggressive or obsessive behavior. Each was examined. Each was cleared. Some because of alibis, others because their psychological profiles did not align. A few simply because there was no concrete evidence left to test. In truth, the Springfield Three case became less a search for a suspect and more a confrontation with a void created by the speed and precision of the abduction, a void widened by contaminated evidence, a void sealed by time. Yet the void did not stop the city from searching. Volunteers kept walking fields long after official searches ended. Dive teams explored lakes years later. Detectives pursued leads even after retirement. Parents waited by phones that never rang. A disappearance like this becomes a wound that never heals. The city tried to move on, but the shadow remained. And within that shadow stood the silhouettes of the suspects, the whispers of their words, the weight of their lies. As we close Part 3, understand this. In cases where evidence is non-existent, suspects become mirrors. They reflect back our fears, our assumptions, and our need for resolution. But somewhere among them, one mirror reflects the truth. Whether that truth belongs to Cox or to another figure, yet unnamed, remains uncertain. Part 4 will lead us into the darkest theories, trafficking rings, multi-offender abduction models, and the possibility that the women were not killed immediately, but held. We will also explore the forensic limitations of the time and what modern technology might reveal if the case were reopened fully. The deeper we go, the heavier the air becomes. But this is where truth tends to hide. End of Part 3. There are investigations that feel like walking through a dense fog. But then there are those like the Springfield Three, where the fog becomes a labyrinth. Every corridor, every theory, every whispered lead branches into another path, darker and more complex than the last. By the time detectives reached the deeper stages of this case, the question was no longer simply what happened inside the house on East Delmar Street. It became a broader, more harrowing question. What kind of force is capable of erasing three people without a sound? The deeper we go, the more the human mind begins to revolt, because the theories that emerge in a case like this are not gentle. They require you to look directly into the darker corners of human behavior, places most people would rather pretend do not exist. I have studied these theories for years. Some are improbable, others are grotesquely plausible, but all of them reveal something about the world we live in and how fragile the boundary of safety truly is. One of the earliest and most persistent theories was that the Springfield Three were victims of a targeted abduction by multiple offenders. This theory grew from the logistics of the crime itself. To subdue 3 adults in the middle of the night without alerting neighbors or causing struggle implies control. Not just control through intimidation, but coordinated control. This suggests either a pair of offenders or a small group. Serious offenders who have worked in pairs often develop silent methods of domination. One controls with a weapon, another ties or restrains, a third may guard. In such scenarios, victims comply because resistance seems impossible. I have examined cases where 2 offenders managed to corral entire families without leaving a trace, using only speed and the element of shock. If we imagine the Springfield Three being confronted in that way, suddenly the silence of the house makes sense. One knock at the door, one voice they believed they could trust, a weapon revealed quickly, a command issued sharply, and 3 women who understood in an instant that survival depended on obedience. This theory aligns with their belongings being left in place. It aligns with the absence of struggle. It aligns with the speed required. But it raises the question that haunts this investigation: why them? Why that house? Why that night? Another, darker theory that circulated for decades was the possibility of trafficking. Human trafficking rings, particularly in the central United States during the early 90s, operated under deep concealment. Interstates like I-44 and I-40 served as arteries for illicit transport. From Springfield, someone could move victims toward Oklahoma City, St. Louis, or even into Texas within hours. No cameras, no toll booth photographs, no digital footprints. But for trafficking to be the motive, something else must align. Victims are usually taken alive and often with intent to sell or exploit. 3 women disappearing without any later sightings undermines this theory somewhat. Trafficking organizations rarely waste victims. They generate movement, whispers, financial trails, even rumors among police informants. Yet, in all the years following the disappearance, there was not a single credible sighting, not one informant claim of 3 women matching their descriptions. Still, some investigators argue that if the women were taken by a highly organized group and then killed soon after, the absence of sightings would be explained. But then we arrive at another question. Why take 3 if the intent was murder? Killing them in the home would have been easier. Leaving 3 bodies presents risk. Taking 3 bodies presents more risk, unless, of course, the abductors had no fear of being seen. Which leads to the next theory, chilling in its simplicity. The killer or killers may have been part of a network familiar with construction, disposal, or burial techniques. This intersects with the tip regarding the hospital parking structure. If offenders had access to a large-scale construction site, burial under concrete becomes not only plausible, but efficient. Bodies buried under fresh concrete are nearly impossible to find without destructive excavation. I have seen offenders in other cases use construction sites as burial grounds precisely because of this. When the concrete is poured, the crime is sealed permanently. But for this to be true in Springfield, one must assume the offenders had access to the site, knowledge of scheduling, and the confidence that no one would question their actions during the early stages of the project. These requirements narrow the suspect pool significantly. Still, there is another theory even more disturbing, that the women were held for a period of time before being killed. Some criminals particularly organized offenders with sadistic tendencies, take victims alive and keep them for hours, days, or weeks. Such perpetrators often build private locations, basements, sheds, or rural properties designed for captivity. In Missouri in the early 90s, there were countless acres of farmland, abandoned barns, remote hunting cabins, and off-grid structures. A determined offender could hold victims in such a place without being discovered. When I interviewed specialists in victim captivity cases, they told me the same thing. Silence does not mean speed. It means isolation. If the Springfield Three were held somewhere, the absence of clues begins to make sense. A remote location would produce no witnesses, no screams, no clues. 3 victims, however, complicate this theory. Controlling one victim is easy. Controlling 2 requires planning. Controlling 3 requires extreme management, fear, or restraints. But I have seen offenders who thrived on domination and engineered systems to control multiple victims simultaneously. It is not impossible. Yet another theory focuses less on the act and more on the perpetrator's psychology. Some offenders abduct in groups because they desire absolute power. They see victims not as people, but as objects, interchangeable, replaceable, disposable. The motive becomes internal rather than external. Not trafficking, not ransom, not revenge, but domination. The act of taking 3 instead of 1 becomes an expression of control, not logic. The psychological satisfaction becomes the goal, and the bodies become afterthoughts. This framework aligns disturbingly well with offenders like Robert Craig Cox, who crave control over narratives, who enjoy holding secrets, who bask in implications rather than confessions. When a killer wants power above all else, the disposal location becomes almost ceremonial. A burial under concrete, a drop site in a mine shaft, a placement within an abandoned structure, something permanent, something symbolic. And then there is the possibility that none of the major theories are correct, that the real answer is one no one has yet imagined. That is the paradox of investigating disappearances. The less evidence you have, the more theories multiply. At some point, you stop searching for the most likely explanation and begin searching for the explanation that best fits the silence. As the theories deepened, investigators hit another wall, the limitations of forensic science in 1992. Today, we could process microscopic DNA. We could reconstruct movement patterns through digital forensics. We could analyze soil, fibers, even vapor traces with advanced tools. But in 1992, none of that was possible. Even fingerprints, if smudged or partial, were useless. Glove marks were unknowable. Hairs could not be DNA tested. Vehicles could not be traced digitally. The entire world of forensic possibility simply did not exist. If the case had unfolded today, nearly every object in Cheryl's home could have been swabbed for DNA. The answering machine's tape could have been analyzed for background noise, the caller's breathing, electronic artifacts. The concrete at the hospital could be scanned with 3D volumetric imaging. Modern ground-penetrating radar could map cavities only millimeters wide. But the case did not happen today. It happened in a world where evidence died quickly and quietly. In reviewing the Springfield Three investigation, I have come to understand that the darkness of this case does not arise simply from what was done to the victims. The darkness arises from what was taken from us. The ability to know what made this case a labyrinth was not the abundance of clues. It was their absence. Every missing piece generated 10 possible explanations. Every silence became a fork in the maze. The more investigators searched, the more paths emerged until the case became less like a linear puzzle and more like a sprawling landscape of what-ifs. And in the heart of that landscape sits a question that has never been resolved. Were the Springfield Three taken by someone they feared or someone they trusted? Fear produces noise. Trust produces silence. The house on East Delmar Street was silent. As we close Part 4, prepare for what comes next. Part 5 delves into the final arc of the narrative, the legacy of the case, the family's decades-long struggle for answers, the cultural impact on Springfield, and the chilling possibility that the truth is known by someone still alive, still silent. In the quiet of unresolved crimes, truth often waits, but it never waits forever. End of Part 4. There are cases that close neatly, cases that offer a diagram of truth, a tidy conclusion, a name, a face, a verdict. And then there are cases like the Springfield Three, where the ending is not an ending, but a shape carved out of absence. When I look back on the 30 years since that June night, what strikes me most is not just the disappearance of 3 women. It is the disappearance of certainty, of closure, of the belief that truth always rises to the surface. It is easy to forget that for the families of Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy, the case did not unfold as a narrative. It unfolded as a wound that reopened every time the phone rang, every time a reporter knocked, every time a tipster whispered a new theory. For them, the case did not exist in 5 parts. It existed in thousands of fragments, each one carrying a different kind of hope or agony. In the early years after the disappearance, the families lived suspended between 2 realities. One reality imagined that the women were alive somewhere, held, hidden, waiting. The other imagined that they were gone, buried, their voices extinguished long before help could arrive. Hope in missing persons cases is a fragile thing. It is both the anchor and the knife. It holds you steady while cutting deeper with each passing day. I have spoken with relatives of victims before, but the families of the Springfield Three carried a particular kind of weight. It was the weight of 3 simultaneous absences, 3 rooms left empty, 3 birthdays uncelebrated, 3 faces that didn't age in photographs. The families aged, but the missing women did not. They remained forever 19, forever 18, forever 47. One of the mothers once said that the hardest part was not knowing which grief to feel. Should she mourn or should she wait? All she could do was exist in the space between those 2 choices, a space I have come to call suspended grief. It is grief without direction, grief without permission, grief without proof. As years passed, Springfield changed, but the case remained fixed in time. A memorial was built. Community vigils were held. The police reopened the case periodically, driven not by new evidence, but by the refusal to let it die. Young detectives grew older. Older detectives retired, carrying the case with them like a scar. Even those who never worked the case felt its presence. It cast a shadow over the city, a reminder that safety is a perception, not a guarantee. Throughout my career, I have learned that unsolved cases are not simply mysteries. They are ecosystems. They grow, and they pull people into them. Tipsters, investigators, journalists, conspiracy theorists, psychics, skeptics, each contributes a piece, large or small, helpful or harmful. The Springfield Three case became one of those ecosystems. Every few years, a new rumor would spark interest again. People claimed to have found the burial site. People insisted they had overheard confessions. People believed the answers lay in the parking structure. Some believed the answers lay in Cox's silence. Others believe the answers lay in a location no one has searched. But through all the noise, one truth has endured. The case has never produced a body, never produced physical evidence, never produced the kind of discovery that transforms speculation into fact. In the absence of evidence, a case becomes a mirror reflecting the fears of a community. Some saw a killer who hunted at random. Others saw a carefully planned crime targeting the women specifically. Others saw a conspiracy buried deep within the city. I myself have walked through all these possibilities, not because I wanted to, but because the case demanded it. A detective must step into the darkness, even when it bends the shape of reason. I recall the moment when I realized that the Springfield Three case would likely never be solved in a traditional way. It was not a moment of defeat, but of clarity. Some crimes depend on forensics, some depend on confessions. This one depends on conscience. Someone knows, someone saw, someone remembers something they should not remember, someone heard something they have spent decades trying to forget. The truth is not lost, it is withheld. And withheld truth has a particular sound. It is the echo beneath every unanswered question. It is the silence in Cox's half-smile. It is the unfinished sentence of every suspect who came close to saying more. It is the empty space between what we know and what we fear. As we consider the legacy of the Springfield Three, we must confront an unsettling possibility. The crime may have been perfect. Not perfect in execution, but perfect in outcome. 3 women gone. No trace, no closure. A city left with a wound that never scabs over. For a predator who thrives on control, there may be no greater victory than permanence. But I do not believe permanence is the end of this story. Time has a way of shaking loose the truth. People age, alliances shift, secrets become heavier than silence. Conscience corrodes like rust, and sometimes the smallest detail resurfaces when no one expects it. If the Springfield Three case is ever solved, it will not be through brilliance or breakthrough. It will be because someone finally speaks. Someone who once stayed silent. Someone who once believed they could carry the weight of that night forever. Until that moment, the story remains open, not because we lack facts, but because we refuse to let the absence of facts become the final word. As I close this final part of the investigation, I am reminded of something Cheryl once told one of her clients, long before the night she vanished. She said that life is made not of certainty, but of persistence. You keep going, even when the road ahead disappears. The Springfield Three deserve that persistence. They deserve to be found, whether in truth, in memory, or in the moment when silence finally breaks. And until that day comes, their story will remain here in the echoes that never fade. End of Part 5.